everybody, and welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is Joe Moore coming at you. I'm actually in a basement at the University of Pennsylvania right now, attending Philadelic, but needed to record this intro. So this is an episode with Rick Doblin. I really loved this one. I got to go to his backyard in Massachusetts and talk all about the recent FDA decision, and I really had an educational experience here with Rick, and I feel like my thesis and understanding was more accurate than a lot of what popular media has colored this situation by. So very happy to see that, and hopeful that MDMA will still finish this FDA process. I think we're going to see, tragically, other companies come first, but it's going to be okay, especially with a lot of this state work and decrim work and things developing in a pretty robust way in the underground markets as well. So loving all of it. So really special thanks to Rick for having me over. Really excited to see what's going to happen with MAPS. It's going to be an interesting ride. All right, that's it. Thank you all for tuning in, and we'll see you on the other side. Cool. Here we are. Rick Doblin's backyard. How are you, Rick?
I'm doing well. I, had a red eye flying home from an event in California, but luckily we're doing this in the afternoon. So I showed up at 6 in the morning. So I'm happy to be home, and it's beautiful here, and we're outdoors.
Thanks for doing it despite a red eye. I would be in shambles.
Oh, well, you're my first appointment today.
Outstanding. So
we should say that it was at 3:30 in the afternoon.
Right. It's not like 10 a.m. or anything.
Right.
So I'm excited today because a lot's happened in your world in the last number of months.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to speak to.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to bother introducing you here.
Okay.
People on Psychedelic Station know, and I'll do it in the intro. But there's been so much, right? You've resigned from the board at Lykos.
Yeah.
You've really leaned into MAPS again in a really robust public way.
Yeah.
You just got out of a rejuvenating Burning Man.
Yes.
Gave 7 talks.
Yeah.
But let's talk about leading up to the advisory committee and the FDA decision first. Let's kind of keep it in a little bit of historical order. So we got to chat a little bit in Aspen, and you were really confident. We were all confident too, and it didn't seem likely that they were going to deny this. So can you talk a little bit about that confidence, and then going into AdCom and beyond, what that was like?
Well, the confidence was built on 8 months of negotiations with FDA in 2017 about how the phase 3 studies would be designed. So it was a process called Special Protocol Assessment. And it's available to pharmaceutical companies once you get past your what's called the end of phase 2 meeting, and you can start working on phase 3. It delay things quite a bit, so it delayed us 8 months. But most of the time, there's not that much controversial stuff or unusual things. So pharma companies tend not to use the Special Protocol Assessment process. But I knew we would have real challenges about how to do the double blind. And that turned out to be what the advisory committees and ICER and others focused on. But I knew it was going to be a problem. And so we engaged in this 8-month process, and it was in full light of the problems of functional unblinding. And we presented 16 years of phase 2 research to the FDA, where I had completed my dissertation from the Kennedy School on the regulation of the medical use of psychedelics and marijuana in 2001. And a big part of it was how to figure out how to do a proper double-blind study. And my conclusion was that the best approach is to do therapy with low-dose MDMA versus therapy with full-dose MDMA. So everybody is expecting MDMA, and then everybody's going to get some activity, and then the challenge is to find the dose of MDMA that's large enough to cause some confusion. Microdosing wouldn't work because, microdosing by definition is something that just is very subtle, and it doesn't really affect your perceptions, things like that. So microdosing doesn't work. But you don't want a dose that's so high that you have so much therapeutic potential that you can never tell a difference between that and your full dose. So the challenge was to find what's the ideal dose. So in 16 years, roughly, of phase 2 studies, MAPS looked at therapy, which we developed to optimize the therapeutic approach, manualized treatment manual. So we have what we consider to be an evidence-based therapy called inner-directed therapy. And we studied therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with 25 milligrams, 30 milligrams, 40 milligrams, 50 milligrams, 75 milligrams, 100, 125, and 150. So we really covered the ground.
Wow.
And the goal, as I said, was to try to find what's the right dose that would really do well to find this sweet spot of, enough activity to cause confusion, but not so much that it's so therapeutic. And so, and I really think that is ideally, conceptually, the best way to do double-blind studies with drugs that are so active that pretty much if you've taken them. So if we had tranquilizers, let's say, as active placebos, patients and therapists would tell it apart. If you had stimulants, there's some question about whether there would be confusion, but people with PTSD don't self-medicate with stimulants. They self-medicate with marijuana, with alcohol, with opiates, with downers. They don't make themselves more alert in a way, and so there's some ethical questions about using stimulants. And also, pretty astute therapists, I think, can mostly tell the difference. So we talk about double blind. It's blind both to the people getting the substance, but also to the research team, the therapist team. So what we discovered was that I was partially right and partially wrong. And luckily, we discovered this well after I got my Ph.D. But what surprised us was that the lower doses were successful in causing some confusion. There was enough activity. These are 25, 30, 40 milligrams, basically 50 we also looked at.
I've never taken that little.
Yeah, well, what we found is that it made people uncomfortable. So keep in mind, these are not average healthy people. These are people with severe PTSD or moderate to severe PTSD that they've had for, on average, 14 years or more. 90% of these people have had suicidal ideation. About 40% have had serious suicidal ideation. About 1/3 have had what's called positive behavior, meaning that they either tried to kill themselves or they bought a rope and thought about it but didn't use it, or went to a bridge and thought about jumping off but didn't do it. So these are people that are really deeply troubled with memories of prior trauma, and it's influencing their ability to get anything done and their serious quality of life. So what we discovered was that the lower doses are like turbulence in an airplane when you're first taking off, and you have to get above the clouds sometimes before it's smooth sailing. So what we found is that those people that got these lower doses still got better, but they didn't get as much benefit as people that got therapy without any MDMA at all. So that so we would say,
I misunderstood those results. That's really great for clarity. Thank you.
Yeah. So they had, when I say anti-therapeutic effect, they still did get better, but they didn't get as much benefit as the people that got no MDMA at all. And then the other thing that we discovered, which was also surprising to me, was that the 75 milligram dose group was really effective. So that the lower doses, the dose at which it was very effective was lower than we thought. We did one project with 30 milligrams, 75 milligrams, and 125. And this was with veterans, firefighters, and police officers. And again, to our surprise, the 75 milligram dose group did the best, even more than the 125. Now, in part, when you do randomization, that doesn't mean that things always end up equal. So the 125 group had much higher depression scores on average than the 75 milligram dose group. Maybe that was something to do. But what it meant was that we really couldn't find this sweet spot between where this dose of MDMA is either making people uncomfortable or where it flips over and now is very helpful. So we went to the FDA as part of this special protocol assessment process, and we said, you tell us what to do. We can give you blinding if you want, but this is the key point. You're going to make our job easier to find a difference between the two groups, because if therapy with inactive placebo does better than therapy with low dose, when you compare to therapy with low dose, you're making it easier to find a difference between the two groups, the therapy with full dose. So we said, we're willing to give you blinding, you tell us, but at the same time, the real question is, if you can do this work with therapy, why bother add a drug? So we should make it harder on ourselves, and we should compare therapy with inactive placebo, which would get us better results than therapy with a dose that would do blinding. And the FDA brought in Bob Temple, who was the old wise man at the FDA, been there since 1972, the Office of Science Policy. He came into this final meeting. And in the end, the FDA said, we want you to do therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with full dose MDMA. And then they said there are two main ways to deal with experimenter bias when that happens. The first is easy. It's called random assignment. So a lot of studies would treat a bunch of people, then they would take those failures and say, of the people that didn't succeed in whatever the treatment was, do you want to volunteer for something new? And so the people that volunteer are different than the people at the very beginning, because they're more willing to try to get healing. They're more prone to likely get better results. So random assignment means everybody's similarly motivated. And that's a standard feature for pretty much every double-blind, placebo-controlled randomized study. The other thing that the FDA said is that you really need to have independent raters who are blind to the condition that they're evaluating the people. So the independent raters, you don't have therapists rate how the patients are doing. You don't have the patients do just self-report. It's an hour-long interview by trained raters, and they're blind as to whether the person they're talking to had the MDMA or had the inactive placebo. And so we had a pool of over 20 raters in the CAPS, the clinician-administered PTSD scale, and mostly trained by the Boston VA, actually, where the CAPS was developed. Periodically, they would do what's called inter-rater reliability. They would all watch a videotape, and they would rate it, and to see that they have pretty narrow band consistent ratings. So that's what the FDA said. So that's what we did. So that and all the other things that we negotiated with FDA gave us this confidence that when it came time to review the data, that the FDA would stick with the agreements that we had made before. And we were able to conclude this special protocol assessment with an agreement letter, which is a kind of a legal document saying that they do select this design. Now, what had happened since is that the people at the FDA that we made these agreements with had left the FDA, and new people were now in charge of the Division of Psychiatry. And they were more younger, more inexperienced, more conservative. And just to give you an example of that, with the first group of people that we worked with, we got a protocol to give MDMA to therapists as part of their training to help them be more understanding of what their patients are going through when they do MDMA. It seems like kind of a common sense idea that if you're going to go to a yoga teacher, you don't go to somebody that didn't do yoga, or you're going to go to a meditation teacher, you don't do somebody that never meditated.
It used to be pretty typical in psychiatry, especially in Groff's day, but yeah, it went out of vogue for some reason.
Yeah, well, now I'd say that if some of the Lykos people were concerned that if you give MDMA to a therapist, they're not a patient, they don't have a diagnosis. And they're like, oh, that's like legalization. We can't have that. That's, so, and there's hey, there's no proof. These are the traditional pharma people. There's no proof that therapists who have done MDMA are any better than therapists who've not. And their only standard of proof is you need large-scale controlled studies of therapists that have never done MDMA compared to therapists who have done MDMA, and that will take years and millions of dollars. And that's not really the only standard of proof. And so in any case, this FDA approved this protocol, and 125 people went through it, and virtually everybody that worked on phase 3 had their own MDMA experience. Then we wanted to get a new protocol approved with this new bunch now in charge. And because the original protocol was 4 days long, it's a double-blind, placebo-controlled crossover study, meaning day 1, you either get MDMA or placebo. Day 2, you have a day of integration. Day 3 is the crossover. Whatever you didn't get the first day, you get now the third day. And then the fourth day is a day of integration. And that was to prepare people for doing clinical research where they'll be giving placebos. And we wanted them to know, what's it like to be a patient sitting there for 8 hours without the MDMA, just with the music, with the eye shades on, and sometimes conversations with the therapists. And so things had changed when we submitted this new protocol. The new people were in charge, and they had, after they approved MAPS to go to phase 3, where we had the lead therapist was licensed to do therapy. Second person didn't have to have a license. They could be in a program to get a license or all. And we negotiated that a doctor would be on call, would do the screenings and be on call, but didn't need to be on site. So that was 2017. Then along comes 2018, and along comes Compass and USONA, and FDA is like thinking, oh, this is getting big. This could be really concerning. What if something goes wrong? So then they started saying, oh, we need a doctor on site, and we need MD, Ph.D. for the lead therapist, not just licensed to therapy. And these groups agreed to do that because they tended to work in academic centers, and there's doctors on site, and there's, an overflow of MD, PhDs. And so then when we submitted this new protocol to the FDA, it was rejected. And they said, oh, it's too risky to give MDMA to therapists. They don't have any, there's no benefit. They don't have any indication. But not only that, your people are completely underqualified. That, you've proposed that people have the lead person be licensed therapist. He said, oh, that's not good enough. Now you need MD or PhD. So because we had the special protocol assessment, they couldn't force us to change how we did phase 3 without any evidence that there was a better approach, and there was no evidence that there was a better approach. But they tried to impose it, and then they said you need a doctor on site. So we protested. We sent them all this information about doctors on site versus doctors on call, no difference in safety. MD PhDs on the team as compared to not, no difference in efficacy. So there was really no justification for doing it other than the FDA looking like they were being rigorous so that they're creating a written record. So we protested this, and we had meetings called Type A meetings with FDA. They went nowhere, basically. So then we launched a formal dispute resolution process, which is with formal dispute resolution request, is the FDRR, with lawyers who specialize in these scientific disputes with FDA, but they force FDA to go by proper procedures and all. And then we won completely. And not only did we win, but it helped the entire field. And we've just had a new formal dispute recently about the FDA. The same division of psychiatry has blocked us from doing a study. We have a $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan for cannabis for PTSD. Now, I should say that cannabis for PTSD is palliative. It's not curative. It's something that you tend to need every day. It helps people not have nightmares, focuses on the present, has some emotional lifting of mood a bit for different people, but it's like another SSRI, or it's a daily medication, controls symptoms, doesn't get to the root of the problem, but it's important. And there's hundreds of thousands of people that use cannabis for PTSD in states all over the country, but it's not covered by insurance. So if we can go through the FDA and prove it, then it'll be an enormous gift to all these people using cannabis for PTSD, because then it could be covered by insurance. So for several years, FDA has blocked this project, and they have refused to let us study smoked marijuana. And they insinuated in different ways that marijuana causes lung cancer, that it's too dangerous to take through the lungs. We know that marijuana does not cause lung cancer, and not only we, is the scientific community, but it's also the National Institute on Drug Abuse no longer claims that marijuana causes lung cancer. And FDA was also blocking us from vaporization, which doesn't even combust the marijuana. People may be familiar with the packs, which is you put a bud into this device, it heats it up, you get a steam, but it doesn't combust it. So we were blocked. Then we were initially blocked from doing patient self-titration. So, when we do MDMA, everybody gets the same dose, they swallow it, that's that. But with cannabis, it's possible for people to adjust their dose. You get pretty rapid feedback. When you take MDMA, it takes about an hour to really start fully feeling it. But when you do cannabis 10, 15 minutes or 5 minutes, sometimes you can adjust to according to the symptoms that you're trying to reduce. So patient self-titration is really a helpful tool. And it's the way people actually use it. Some days might be an anniversary of some tragedy, and that day is worse than other days. So they don't necessarily use the same amount every day. And we want to see basically in real life how people use cannabis. And the FDA was like, no way, we're not going to let you do that. It all has to be standardized and the same thing. The other thing just to say about botanicals, and this is about plant medicines, this will apply to ayahuasca or even mushrooms, that it's very difficult to be as precise as it is with synthetic drugs about what your content is of this.
Makes scientists really uncomfortable, typically.
Yeah. It's
obnoxious.
Yeah, so it's but when you have self-titration, people can adjust their dose. You don't need as precise. So some of the buds differ slightly from other buds. But if you can adjust your dose, then I think botanical medicines can be made into drugs that the FDA approves if you combine and accept a slight, variability within certain limits for your product, but then people able to adjust their dose. So anyway, FDA was rejecting patient self-titration, and they were upset that we didn't want to use crappy marijuana from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and we wanted to use 20% THC imported from Canada. We wanted to use 2 grams per day and give it to people, and 2 grams of 20% THC is a lot. But surveys have indicated how much cannabis people with PTSD tend to use, so that seemed reasonable. And then it wasn't clear, but FDA was wanting everybody to have prior experience with cannabis, and some was concerning that they wanted them to be current smokers. So anyway, we protested. We did another formal dispute. And the point I'm trying to make here is that the Division of Psychiatry has become more conservative than the groups that we initially negotiated with in ways that we've been able, for the first formal dispute, to have senior management reverse, and we'll see what happens with this second. And so it was pretty clear to me that we had really thoroughly discussed functional unblinding with the FDA, and there is no good solution. So just to add to this, that Lykos has now hired a fella, David Huff. He was the one that helped move Spravato with ketamine through the FDA. So he's been hired now to lead the effort to move MDMA through the system. But what he said in an interview with Psychedelic Alpha was very interesting. He said that the double blind really fails way more often than people realize, and not just with psychedelics. So he talked about antipsychotic research with schizophrenia. And he said that these antipsychotics have such powerful side effects that people can tell if they've got it or not. The same is true, we've heard about SSRIs, that there are the side effect profiles that the patients get that often they report to the physicians are such that it helps people to understand which group they're in. So that the idea of double blind is more of an idealized approach in theory, but in practice, it fails way more than people want to admit. So it's sort of a dirty secret about psychedelic and other research through the FDA that the double blind is theoretically ideal, but in practice, it doesn't work. So what happened was that I think Lykos made a fundamental mistaken assumption, which was that with hundreds of for-profit psychedelic companies and with lots of positive media, that we had reached the point where the culture didn't matter anymore. The culture had been transformed. The culture was open to this psychedelics, and all that mattered was the data. And this was now a rational process. And all that mattered was this discussion with FDA about the actual data. And as a result, these traditional pharma people said, oh, we want a quiet period. And that's what pharma companies tend to do when they're developing their drug. Now, these are drugs that nobody's ever heard of, that don't have, a widespread non-medical use. 22 million Americans have tried ecstasy or MDMA. And usually when these pharma companies developing these new drugs, they don't have people that are critics or oppose. So this quiet period that Lykos adopted as their strategy and then successfully persuaded members of the MAPS board that should be controlling what MAPS does, that the nonprofit became controlled by the for-profit, which is super twisted. And so both myself and MAPS were knocked out of communications when the critics started coming. And Lykos's adoption of this quiet period created this vacuum. And what happened was that we lost control over the narrative. And it just kept getting more and more negative, and there wasn't a corresponding response because, Lykos thought it didn't matter. Culture doesn't matter, media doesn't matter. The most worst example of that was an article in the Washington Post well before the FDA Advisory Committee that was questioning this whole idea of the double blind and how it didn't work. And I wanted to respond, and Lykos blocked me from doing that through the MAPS board and through themselves. And they got this email saying, we don't need to persuade the Washington Post, we just need to persuade the FDA. Now, if you look at what the advisory committee people did, they were way more influenced by the media than they were by the scientific briefing package that they got from the FDA. And even the scientific briefing package was colored by the new people at the FDA so that they would have this whole long section about the double blind. And they would say, we have all these questions. The double blind didn't work, but we agreed to it. So there would be this few sentences in a couple different places, but we agreed to this. But the rest would be their concerns about functional unblinding. So it was kind of a mixed message that the FDA Advisory Committee got. Now, also, Lykos had the sense in their mind that resources are limited, but therefore they should not do anything else but work with the FDA. So we had started research in Europe, and there had been phase 2 studies to train therapists to get them ready for phase 3 in the Netherlands and Germany and England and some other countries. And Lykos decided to shut all that down. And that, I think, was also a big strategic mistake, because the more regulators from around the world are moving forward on something, the more the FDA feels they're part of a pack. And there's also a little bit of a competition. Who's the first to approve breakthrough drugs? So by Lykos stopping all the international work and just focusing on the FDA, they created a context where there was no kind of external support. And also in the Dutch situation, where there had been very profound benefits for those people that were in these early studies. So the Dutch government said, there's no entity trying to make MDMA into a medicine in Europe. So therefore, we should start the Dutch State Committee on MDMA to look at the evidence and decide what we should do. And so the Dutch State Committee was the Dutch equivalent of the FDA Advisory Committee meeting, except for that they were real subject matter experts. And they spent about a year reviewing the same data that the FDA Advisory Committee spent a couple weeks reviewing. And this Dutch State Committee on MDMA published a book-length report on their findings. And the FDA Advisory Committee meeting issued its rejection that recommended not approval on June 4th. The Dutch State Committee came out on June 6th, 2 days later. For whatever reason, the Lykos PR people decided not to mention this. And they tried a political approach more so than a combined political and scientific approach to criticize the FDA AdCom. And so what happened was that the Dutch committee recommended, first off, reviewed the same data and said, we're persuaded that efficacy has been proven. We're persuaded, based on their own data and all this other data, that safety was demonstrated, and that in the absence of any entity trying to make this into a medicine in Europe, that there was a major unmet medical need, that what should happen is the Dutch government should approve what they called naturalist studies, which are like compassionate use. Similar to what's going on in Australia, there's the special protocol program for compassionate use in Canada. And so there's a meeting October 3rd coming right up of the Dutch Parliament to take and review these recommendations to see what they're going to do about that. So we have two competing views. One from the Dutch committee that actually knew what they were talking about and knew about, if you watch the FDA advisory committee meeting, there's numerous times people will say, well, this is, I'm really not an expert in this, but, multiple times they would say that. So I think that what happened was this Dutch committee, by not letting people know about that, but by not promoting that, it let the narrative be, oh, the FDA advisory committee knows what they're doing and they're negative and there's all these problems. And there was, of course, critics who were very effective. Now, I don't really fault the critics. I mean, the whole point of science is you try to disprove things, both through replication and through experiments. And so you can expect critics should criticize. That's fine. I think when you don't respond to the criticism, you create this vacuum. It's filled with negativity. You lose control of the narrative. And so that's what happened. Now, I just want to say that there is movement towards starting a new nonprofit in Europe by some of the Dutch. There's a group, Psychedelics Europe, that's in Brussels to negotiate. So some of the people from the Netherlands, from Psychedelic Europe, will form this new nonprofit in Europe. And the goal is to try to negotiate with, first off, the Dutch government to get these naturalistic studies approved, then to try to get them approved in multiple countries around Europe, and then to negotiate with the European Medicines Agency and the MHRA, FDA equivalent in England, and say, can 150 or whatever people in these naturalistic studies be bundled together and be the equivalent of like a phase 3 study? Now, there's no specific control group, but there's a lot of other data around. So anyway, that's what's coming from this Dutch committee report. We'll see what happens with the Dutch Parliament on October 3rd. But there's an effort to potentially try to make MDMA into a medicine within a nonprofit context in Europe with open science. And the challenge, of course, is can we do it with just donations? And how much needs to be donated will depend on whether these naturalist studies will be accepted as data by EMA and MHRA. So what happened by the FDA, during these 2 months after the FDA advisory committee meeting, there was no mention in the public media by Lykos about the Dutch committee. There was no real defense explaining how we arrived at the phase 3 design. And also there was a lot of criticism by the FDA advisory committee. And even the FDA said, oh, we don't regulate psychotherapy. We don't understand psychotherapy. And therefore your therapy, we don't like your therapy, this interdirected therapy. It's anything goes. It's not that at all. We had a manualized therapy. We'd had it reviewed by experts in manualized therapies at the National Institute of Mental Health. We have quantitative evaluations called adherence criteria. We've trained adherence raters. We, have measures of adherence. So we had very good adherence to this method. So it's a unique method. And so Lykos did not really defend the therapeutic approach either or explain it. So there were several key uncertainties and criticisms. Now, that were left really not addressed in the public sphere and not really addressed at the FDA level either. And so these uncertainties just built up. And what the FDA did was worse than any of us thought. It was not, I thought that the FDA would say, there's all these criticisms of functional unblinding, but we agreed on the design, and your design was highly significant. Not just, you have to have 0.05, which is 1 in 20 chance that it's random. If you have that or better, then it's statistically significant. We had 0.0001, 1 in 10,000 that the first study was resulting from random results, not from the MDMA being better than the therapy without MDMA. The second one was 0.0004. So it's 1 in 2,500. And you multiply them together, it's 1 in 25 million that 2 of these studies would generate results that would have nothing to do with the MDMA. So you could say, oh, functional unblinding, but it's interesting when you talk about what the blinding actually was, too. So over 90% of the people that got the MDMA knew they got the MDMA. But of the people that got the placebo, 75% were sure they got the placebo, but 25% were either unsure, about 19% or so were unsure, and around 6% thought they had MDMA. So it's not like it was 100% clear to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And you can do a lot of therapeutic work in this context with 8 hours, with, evocative music, and you're primed and really good therapists. So when you start working on your issues, then it makes it somewhat difficult to tell. Is it MDMA? Is it not? So I really think that the issue now is going to be, we know that the FDA Division of Psychiatry has been excessively conservative in 2 different situations, one of which has already been reversed by senior management. The other is under review to be reversed by senior management. And so now the question is, how is Lykos going to negotiate with FDA about what needs to be done next? And so that's now up to Lykos. Now that I have left the Lykos board, I don't know how these negotiations are thoroughly going. Chris, we do have another representative of MAPS on the Lykos board, so our views are being represented. And so the hope is that over the next couple months that there'll be some new agreements maybe about what needs to be done to go forward. And then Lykos will figure out what that means in terms of how much it costs, how much it delays things, what that means for the valuation. And so I guess the most important message I want to leave with people is that Lykos will be able to raise the money. They'll just lower the valuation to where it's a great investment for whoever invests, and they will eventually succeed. But the point is that you don't have to have great results to succeed. So the message that I think a lot of the field is getting, which I think is the wrong message, is that don't use psychedelics with therapy. And much of the field is saying, okay, we don't use therapy. We use psychological support. And this maybe makes it somewhat easier for the FDA to say not therapy. But the FDA, according to Psychedelic Alpha, one of the things that was in the complete response letter that was what FDA gave rejecting the new drug application was that they wanted MDMA to be combined with an evidence-based therapy, and potentially also with another arm looking at just minimal psychological support, whatever that means. So I think already, though, the message is getting misunderstood because the FDA is saying we want to see MDMA with an evidence-based therapy. Even though it's outrageous for the FDA to tell a pharma company what to study, the pharma company says, we want to study it. You tell us if it's effective. So for the FDA to say, don't use this inner-directed therapy, I think it's completely out of bounds for them to say that. But I've not seen this letter, so I don't know exactly what it says. But this is so the other aspect of it is that it could delay things 2 to 3 years. And so that's terrible for the investors. That's, heartbreaking for those of us that have been working 38 plus years. But the real problem, the real damage is going to be for the PTSD patients who need new treatments. There hasn't been a new treatment for PTSD in like 30, 40 years. It's just very, very painful. And the FDA could have approved under rigorous circumstances to gather whatever safety data they want. But instead, I think what happened was that the critics were so astoundingly effective, and the Lykos was so astoundingly ineffective in trying to explain why things were certain done, that it ended up with this really surprising rejection.
Yeah, furthering your point, like this idea of we know the suicide rate in America.
Yeah.
We know the veteran suicide rate in America. And to not factor that into the calculations on account of science is like really callous. And
yeah.
I don't know, not in line with my values.
Well, I'll say one thing. MAPS is trying to do international work. So Lykos is basically focused just on the U.S., and so MAPS, the nonprofit, is looking at globalization to high trauma, low resource countries where the for-profit company is not ever going to go. And so we're doing trainings of therapists all over the world. We're working towards a training we're trying to schedule now in Ukraine for Ukrainians. Yeah. We're working on a project with Syrian refugees in Denmark. We've trained people in Bosnia to work with survivors of the roughly 30 years ago, the Civil War there, the Srebrenica massacre, where 8,000 Muslim men and boys were killed. And so these will be the women survivors traumatized from that. And what we did is a training in Iceland. We're also trying to, there's quite a psychedelic community in Iceland, and it's kind of a mystical culture with incredible nature and volcanoes and all that stuff. But we had a meeting with the Minister of Justice and his deputy to talk about MDMA to reduce recidivism, MDMA therapy to take people that are getting out of prison, help them deal with their traumas. And can we do that? But there was a deputy that said something really interesting that framed things in a very clear way. And he had come from private industry. Now he was working in government. And what he said was the biggest shock for him. He says, in the private industry, you get fired if you do nothing. He said, but in the government, you get fired if you do something. So it's not surprising that, lower level division people at the FDA have more of a bias, you could say, towards saying no rather than saying yes. The other thing to keep in mind is that the division of psychiatry has grown out of other divisions. There's been reorganizations at different times through the FDA. And an earlier incarnation of the division of psychiatry is the group that approved OxyContin for long-term use without the right data. So that was a big scandal. And we've, all of these documents of the FDA were then made available to members of Congress, and everybody's trying to look at this. So I think that there's this kind of preference to show that they're being harsh, the FDA to not approve things. So that's where the first formal dispute that we won. It was, I think, not so much that the FDA was against what we were trying to do, the division of psychiatry. They just didn't want to take responsibility for making this decision. So when they stop referring to the science that we're giving them and just keep saying no, in a way that you can read that as an invitation that they would rather this decision be made by their superiors so that they will be the ones that take responsibility so they don't get fired for doing something. So I think that's how I see things. And so I think that the issue will be right now, what is going to be negotiated over the next couple of months or so? Will there come to agreement? And I think that FDA will come to some agreement. I think it will be very difficult for the FDA to back away from agreements a second time.
Yeah.
After they've done that once before, which they should not have done. So overall, I'm optimistic that eventually things will happen. MAPS has been, 38 and a half years. So, we're not about to throw up our hands in despair because there's a new bump in the road. But it's more in the hands of Lykos, and it's more in the hands of people that are more traditional pharma. So MAPS has lost control over the pharma company. And I think that part was really tragic. And it was also that we were a victim of our own success. And so what happened was that, in 2017, I described that we had these special protocol assessments. We had what we called the capstone, where we tried to raise $30 million and succeeded in doing that for money for phase 3. And then there was other companies that came along and, the restrictions got more and more imposed, but that there was then a pathway through the FDA. So it wasn't so that it could only be through philanthropy. The political obstacles had been removed. The FDA was open to research. So that led to hundreds of for-profit psychedelic companies. So when I look now at Hefter Research Institute, the Council on Spiritual Practices, Beckley Foundation, MAPS, the nonprofits, since MAPS started in 86, have raised somewhere in the neighborhood collectively of $300 million. In donations, which is pretty impressive. However, in the last 4 years, $4 billion has gone into for-profit psychedelics. And so when MAPS was now at this situation where, okay, now after this capstone money, now we were told by Boston Consulting Group and others, we need to raise $80 million to prepare for commercialization, and we need to do it right away. And pharma companies would have started a year before. And we were unable to raise that amount of money from donors, and we ended up having to take money from investors. And that means that instead of thinking about public benefit, now you have to balance public benefit with a return to shareholders. And then a bunch of people were saying, okay, now to get the investors, they want to see that Lykos is separate. It's run by pharma people. And we see with OpenAI, it's really interesting, is that was another model of a nonprofit that was going to control a for-profit. And that's dissolving now, as this for-profit is supposedly worth $150 billion now. And then also we've got this, different set of decision makers who come from a more traditional approach. And so that's where I think we're at now.
It's a lot to juggle. And
yeah.
Is it still the case that MAPS is interested in Ibogaine?
Oh, yeah, very, very much. MAPS is very much, so I call it open Ibogaine. But there are two groups that are using investor money to make Ibogaine into a medicine. One is Atai, and they're trying to develop a different delivery system that they could patent rather than oral pills for Ibogaine or Iboga. But they're looking at
Do you know anything about it? If it's like a sub-Q kind of infusion
I
thing?
think it might end up being some sort of an injection, either IV, IM, or sub-Q, I'm not sure. But something that they could patent.
Yeah.
That's the point. And then a group at Stanford has tried to develop Ibogaine for traumatic brain injury. And
right.
Okay, and this is an interesting object lesson. MAPS was started in 1986 as a nonprofit. The Ibogaine research, accompanied by Howard and Norma Lotsoff, was started also in 1986.
Have you seen that film yet?
I've seen part of it, yeah.
Wow, it's unbelievable.
Yeah. Maybe you can link to it for people.
That's a good idea.
From Night to Light or something like that.
Something like that.
And so, but they started as a for-profit, and they started patenting the uses of Ibogaine. And before long, there was just all sorts of litigation about intellectual property. And it destroyed Ibogaine for decades. Just all these people suing each other. And so now there is a clear path to make Ibogaine into a medicine for opiate dependence or fentanyl dependence that is not going to violate anybody's patents. And how do we get the money? So Brian Hubbard was in the Attorney General's office in Kentucky. Kentucky was getting something like $840 million from the pharma industry for all the damage they caused from the opiate epidemic. And Brian in the Attorney General's office was trying to put 5%, $42 million, into Ibogaine research. And when you do that with public money, then it's open science, it's not investors. So that gave me the idea maybe MAPS could get involved back in Ibogaine. We've done early Ibogaine observational studies of clinics in New Zealand and Mexico, and we would do baseline measurements, and then once a month for a year, we would look at outcomes, so longer outcomes, and it was very promising. But then that never went anywhere. And so now that there was this thought about public money, I got more involved because I don't want to do it with investor money. There's already investor money going in other ways. But then what happened is the new attorney general came in and shut down the Kentucky. So Brian Hubbard is trying to get other states to do it. And now the most likely one, a big effort, is going to take place in Texas. And there's an effort now to try to get $50 million from Texas for Ibogaine research that would be in the public domain. So MAPS is interested in that, but there's no resources yet to do that because I've seen what happens when you take investors. And at least for Ibogaine, I'd rather say, look, we're in a national crisis. Let's see if we can get public money and donor money to do it. I guess I should say that the rejection by the FDA of MDMA, even though we had prior agreements, and what it means to me is that we need even more public education and we need even more drug policy reform in order to get access to those people that are suffering sooner. And so I think a lot of MAPS's focus is now going to be on public education and on drug policy reform. So one of the things that we talked about before we started recording is just this initiative in Massachusetts that's going to be on the ballot, similar to the Colorado natural plant medicines, to make them available in regulated contexts by the state, both for people with a diagnosis and also for people for personal growth, and also to permit home cultivation that would now be legal for mushrooms, and sharing but not selling. So I think it's going to, the sort of move towards drug policy reform with psychedelics, it's all going to be focused now on Massachusetts. and will this ballot initiative pass? From the point of view of MDMA, people have this sort of romantic idealization of nature. So if it's from if it's from a plant, it's good. If it's from a synthetic, oh my God, now we're worried about it. So when you add MDMA to these initiatives and you do the polling, it doesn't pass anymore. So, the Oregon Psilocybin Initiative is just for psilocybin. The Colorado is natural plants, but not MDMA or LSD. And Massachusetts, similarly, is just natural plants, not MDMA or LSD, but we hope that it'll pass. And then the other aspects of public education are just, now I'm freed because I'm no longer on the Lykos board. They use that to block MAPS and block me from speaking, saying that I should be representing the views of the investors and of the for-profit company, which is completely twisted, the tail wagging the dog. But it's also not even true in the business world, because a lot of times there is this whole idea of called activist investors, that you don't like the management. You don't think that they're maximizing profit. That's generally the way it is. And somebody will buy a minority stake of a company, get appointed to the board, and then criticize what they're doing and try to take it over and try to get rid of the management and try to, refocus them on making more money, something like that. So it's not the case that all the board members need to parrot what the management wants to say. So, but in any case, that's the context that we found ourselves in. And so now I'm free. And the other big part of our public education is gathering the community together. So MAPS is organizing what will be the world's largest conference on psychedelics ever in Denver, Psychedelic Science 2025. Psychedelic Science 2023 had 12,400 people. It was utterly astonishing. It was also in Denver. But the difference now is that now the Natural Plant Medicines Initiative in Colorado is moving forward. So we're going to have experiential opportunities as part of a scientific conference before and after the conference. We did before with holotropic breath work, but we didn't really have all sorts of people who want to offer ayahuasca ceremonies or mushroom ceremonies, or others will. So people will have the opportunity to sort of inner work and intellectual work as part of the same conference. So MAPS is really focusing on how I think there's been enormous reputational damage to MAPS, to the field of psychedelics, to the FDA decision has ricocheted all over the world not to approve MDMA. So after trying to build up a positive narrative for 38 years, now we have lost control of the narrative. And it's mostly negative, and people are now worried about things.
Feels slanderous. It must be really hurtful.
The critics were not constrained to facts,
right?
In their mind, no, they were just throwing out accusations. One of my favorite for how it was outrageous is that I'm a cult leader and MAPS is a cult, and that I'm on par with Scientology and NXIVM. That everything that MAPS does, this was the exact quotes, that MAPS should be reviewed and viewed in this idea that we're like Scientology and we're like NXIVM, which is a little bit exaggerated, I would say.
I haven't seen anybody with the brand yet.
No, it's so. Anyway, we've got a lot of work to do, and so MAPS has had to let people go. Lykos let 75% of the people go. So I guess I encourage people to support MAPS and donate, and we want to build up our base. So we really want to move from several thousand annual donors to 10,000 or more, because now we're entering into a new phase where the drug policy reform and the politics is more important than before. And so now larger numbers of people, like, for example, the more people that we had in Massachusetts, they could take more of an active role on this Massachusetts initiative. So we're sending out messages to our members and asking them and people that donate to MAPS and trying to do that. I've had fundraising events here at the house, right where we are now, and there's going to be another one in New York that I'm going to go to raise money for Massachusetts. And I got my little yard sign, but MAPS is trying to do what we can to help this initiative pass.
So I want to turn to cannabis a little bit.
Oh, great.
So one thing around drug policy that affects me most personally is not being able to openly smoke cannabis in Nevada at Burning Man. And this is something people don't talk about very often, very publicly, right? It's Nevada state level legal. Burning Man happens to happen on federal land.
Right.
And there's tons of federal agents all over the place. It's,
Yes. And the difference, too, is that they're able to convert tickets to fines so that the authorities make a large amount of money giving tickets for cannabis at Burning Man.
Wow.
Hundreds of thousands
So
of
that
dollars.
money leaves the org?
Well, it doesn't go to the org. It goes to the individuals that they catch.
Okay.
And now with psychedelics, they don't have this conversion to a fine. It's a real crime. So they don't make money on psychedelics by busting people. They have to take them and, book them. And if they want to bust people for psychedelics, it basically costs the system money. But if they bust people for marijuana, they can make money. So the key actually at Burning Man is to be very careful about cannabis.
Yes.
And that there's active looking for opportunities to give tickets.
And they've got high-tech gear. It's wild. Yeah, I didn't realize it was a financial situation.
Yeah.
That makes plenty of sense.
I guess you didn't get caught.
Not yet. Thank goodness.
Yeah, it's amazing. The fees are pretty large, too. Now, Burning Man has also hired lawyers to try to help get these fees knocked down, and so that also works, too. But, marijuana is not federally legal, and we just look up north to Canada, where it is federally legal, and so we're kind of, Canada's not falling apart. Massachusetts is not falling apart where it's legal. California, Colorado, these states that have legalized marijuana in many ways are thriving economically and socially, and the police can do other things to work on more violent crime, which is what we really want the police to work on. And so I think that it depends on who gets elected in November, but I predict that if a Democrat, if Kamala Harris gets elected, that sometime in 2025 or 2026, I think we'll have federal legalization of cannabis. And what I mean by that is the same way that alcohol prohibition ended, it will be turned over to the states, and some states will have already legalized and further ones will, but then it won't have this federal prohibition so that they will not be able to go after you on Burning Man land.
Thank goodness. Yeah. I suppose I can survive one more Burning Man that way. That's fun. Thanks for that. It's interesting. I do follow the cannabis stuff a bit, and I'm excited, and I think we will see some movement. And
well, I think that the research project that we hope to start with this $12.9 million grant from the state of Michigan is going to be 320 veterans, and it's going to be, we hope, if everything gets approved, 1.5 grams per day of 20% THC compared to cannabis that has been washed with alcohol and has no more terpenes or cannabinoids. So it's like placebo cannabis. But our first study, and this is kind of interesting, is the first study we had $2.1 million grant from the state of Colorado from their marijuana taxes. And this was in 76 veterans with PTSD. This was all done by Sue Sisley in Phoenix, Arizona, without any support from the Phoenix VA. They refused to cooperate. So all the veterans had to come from outside the VA. And that was an interesting study because we used cannabis from the National Institute on Drug Abuse. It was old, it was dry, it was harsh. And
this is kind of the bad Mississippi cannabis, the federal monopoly deal.
Yes, exactly. So we had one group that was, we wanted it to be 12% THC, and NIDA claimed that it was 12% THC, but we had it analyzed twice. It was 9%. Then we had one group that was 12% CBD, and that was good. And then we had a THC CBD combination, and that was more or less 8% THC, 8% CBD. And then we had an alcohol washed placebo version. And so the results of the study were really fine in terms of the safety profiles. But to give you an example, there was one guy, it was an early veteran in the study, and it was tremendously helpful for him. And so he was not only able to get over a lot of his PTSD symptoms, but he was on opiates for pain, and he was able to get off of the opiates. It was really good. And he said, I'd like to help you. If I can tell my story to the media, maybe that'll get more people to volunteer for the study. And so, yeah, he had all these different media interviews, and we're super curious. Did he get the THC CBD combination? Did he get the THC by itself? Did he get the CBD by itself? And we didn't know, of course, till the end of the study was over. And it turned out he had the placebo. Now he's smoking something. There's a ritual to that, but it wasn't just him. The placebo response was really strong. So in this particular study, the group that got the least benefit, so all the groups improved in their PTSD symptoms, but the group that got the least benefit was the group that got CBD. And you hear about CBD, anti-anxiety, and PTSD is an anxiety disorder in a way. The CBD group got the least benefit. And then the next least was the THC CBD combination. The second best was the placebo. The THC group was the best, but not that much better than the placebo group. So there was no significant evidence of efficacy.
76 people.
76 people, 19 in each group.
Wow.
So the study failed on efficacy, but it was sufficiently. We think the safety database was fine. So, we want to now replicate that. So this particular project will have 320 veterans. If we can get it off of this clinical hold and move it forward. And it's just been narrowed to a group that gets THC and a group that gets placebo. And then, we'll see how that turns out.
Do you think you do that alcohol wash again?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's interesting. That kind of talk track could really flip a place like Texas, for instance.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love that.
So actually what we're hoping for, once we can get everything approved by the FDA, whenever that happens, is that there would be, I think it'd be the Ann Arbor VA, the Tampa VA, the Houston VA, and the private practice site in Phoenix, but we hope to have cooperation from the Phoenix VA as well.
Good. Yeah. Yeah. Arizona's moving. I've spent a lot of time there lately, and I'm hopeful.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Anything we might have missed that's really important?
Well, I do want to share that there are certain things that MAPS is going to be doing in addition to all of the policy work. So I think I'll just talk about the policy work. We've just really talked about it from a federal point of view and from a state point of view. But there's a lot of things that people can do and that MAPS will be doing on a local city and town level. So we're here in Belmont. Next contiguous to us is Somerville. And so Somerville was passed this thing, natural plant medicines would be the lowest enforcement priority. Then Cambridge did the thing. This all started, this whole sort of psychedelic drug policy reform began with the city of Denver making mushrooms the lowest enforcement priority. So I think people need to be thinking, those people that are listening here, there's a lot of opportunity to work at local levels below the level of the state. And that a lot of progress can be made in those ways, and it can filter up. So I think that's one big thing for people to be kept in mind. The other thing, in terms of the public education, that MAPS is going to be doing a lot of storytelling like that. But when you look at gay rights and gay marriage, similar kind of social justice movements, what really helped them succeed was people coming out, people telling their stories.
Yeah.
And then you think, oh, this guy's great. He's a great athlete. And, oh, I never thought somebody like that would be gay. Well, maybe gay people aren't so terrible or, whatever. So what we need is a really big psychedelic coming out. So I'd like to encourage people to think about family members or others that may have negative attitudes for psychedelics. And maybe you can engage in some of these conversations. The polling that has been done about why people vote for the legalization of marijuana, one of the most important factors is if they know a medical marijuana patient. There's so much propaganda, so much uncertainty. But if you know somebody and you trust them and they say, oh, this thing helped me, then you're like, well, maybe it's not so poisonous. Maybe it's not so bad. So what we need is people who have had even difficult experiences with psychedelics to share their stories. I think people can we need a psychedelic coming out, and do it with the people that are closest to you that may have different attitudes. And if not, speak out in public. There's one that's notable to mention that is on the cover of the Boston magazine. And this particular issue, and it's Eliza Dushku-Palangian, and she was an actress in Buffy and the Vampire. And she's come out about her own use of psychedelics as really helping her deal with trauma, and she's now training to be a psychotherapist with psychedelics. So she's the cover of Boston Magazine. So it's these kind of courageous comings out, and I'd like to encourage people to read that article. It's really interesting, Boston Magazine.
Yeah, I'll go scoop it.
And then she's also talking about the importance of the initiative on the November ballot here in Massachusetts. So I think that those are kind of the main extra things to mention.
Yeah, amazing.
Yeah.
All right, everybody, we'll see you at the MAPS conference mid-June next year.
Yeah, the 16th to the 20th with experiential things before and after. And, if people want to donate to MAPS and, in any amount, that sort of is one of the new directions is for us to build our base, to have more political influence, and to be able to do more public education by communicating to more people, have them get more accurate information. So, and the work that you're doing is so important for this public education effort, because I think the thing to leave people with is that science is downstream of culture. And when you stop paying attention to culture and you just think the science is the only thing that matters, you're in big trouble. And so psychedelic research was blocked for 20 plus years, not just in the US, but all over the world, not because of science, but because of culture. When you take your eye off of culture, you're potentially moving into dangerous territory. And I think that's what Lykos did, is took their eye off of culture. And so I think this public education, drug policy work is really going to be essential going forward.
Rick, thanks so much for the many decades of work.
Yeah.
And let's get it to the finish line with at least a couple of these things. Until next time. Thanks.
Yeah. Oh, actually, so what we didn't mention specifically was this long-term vision of a world of net zero trauma by 2070. So, what is the finish line? What is success? So for me, the real issue is humanity is like lemmings going over a cliff. We're destroying the planet. We're the mass extinctions. We see just in the last few days, these hurricanes that have never been so strong. There's so much danger with nuclear proliferation, totalitarianism, that people are motivated in the U.S. on their fears and anxieties. We have Trump and others are really trying to use the base emotions to get people to hate other people and to use that to build support. So what we need is this mass mental health and by a spiritualized humanity. What I mean by that is people understand, similar to what a lot of the astronauts are seeing, is that we're all part of one community, not just humans, but dog's life itself. And that if your primary identification is part of the earth, then somebody that's a different country or a different religion or a different race or a different gender isn't so much the other, that we have more in common than not. So the idea of net zero trauma is that there's two kinds of traumas. One is things that happen in your life. The other is multi-generational trauma that you can inherit from either your mother or your father. Rachel Yehuda at the Bronx VA in Mount Sinai has done work with Holocaust survivors and their children and has looked at epigenetic markers for transmission, sort of set points for anxiety, depression, things like that. So net zero trauma means that we're not adding to the burden of trauma as a whole. It doesn't mean there's no trauma. There'll always be trauma. It just means that we're once we reach net zero, then we can start reducing the total burden. But I think over the next 10, 20 years, humanity is going to be under even more stress than they are now, with the consequences of having ignored climate change for so long. And also when you start getting, there's an estimate of over 1 billion climate refugees potentially by 2050. That's going to destabilize Europe, destabilize countries, turn people more, again, protect your borders, things like that. So it's kind of an idealistic vision of 2 generations from now, 45 years from now or so, net zero trauma by 2070. But what that points to is not only do we need Lykos to succeed and Compass and Usona and other companies to succeed to make psychedelic medicines available, ideally covered by insurance, but we also need drug policy reform, and we need to do work in where most of the trauma is. People don't have the resources to pay for treatment. So there needs to be philanthropy for all of that. So, this idea of net zero trauma, I developed when I thought, of course, that Lykos was going to succeed, and that then that would be covering sort of the, America and other places that could afford to pay for the treatments. So I think it's even more important now, though, to get more work. So I just want to add that kind of as a sort of concluding thought, too, that what we're about is not just MDMA. We're about bringing psychedelic medicine, and we're not just about it in pharmaceutical, financially remunerative ways. We're also about drug policy reform. And so I think we just got to keep in mind that we're in a crisis, and the wise use of psychedelics can be profoundly helpful for that.
Amen. Yeah, it's a big deal. There's a lot coming down the pipeline, and we need to have the tools ready for it as soon as possible.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, Rick, thanks so much.
Great. Thank you.
And there you have it, everybody. Rick Doblin. I hope you all learned plenty and were entertained. I loved the additional conversation around cannabis. I thought that was really helpful. So please check out what MAPS has going. Consider supporting them in some way. And I hope to see you all at that conference in Denver next year. Could be really fun. All right, everybody. Joe Moore signing off for Psychedelics Today. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.